You were not meant to be a slave to the grind. You were not meant to trade your life force for money. You can escape gravity. You can unlock your life. You got this. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to Unlock Your Life. I'm your host, Jennings Smith. I've got a very special guest on with me today, Mr. Kerry Lutz. I had the pleasure of being on his podcast. So he runs a podcast, the Financial Survival Network. Kerry is a economics guy. He is a student of the Austrian vision of the world in the economics. He's a graduate of Pace University. I enjoyed talking with him. He was extremely knowledgeable, and I wanted him to come on my show and talk with us about what he sees going on, because we know rates are going up crazy. The Fed is all over the place. They're saying one thing. Are they going to do another? And I just wanted to bring Kerry on. So Kerry, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you spending some time with us. How are you doing, man? It's good to see you again.
All right. Great to see you. And I'm really honored to be on your podcast, Jennings. And hey, hopefully we can give a little insight and a little direction in a very difficult macroeconomic environment.
Well, talk to me a little bit before we get into the specifics. Talk to me a little bit about the Austrian model of economics, just for those that don't understand what that is or what that means. And how does that differ, and why did you resonate with that?
Well, basically, it's predicated on the concept that free markets work best, and that most problems that we are suffering from at present and have been for better than 100 years result from government attempts to not just play referee, but to pick winners and losers, to manipulate the economy through interest rates, and to pretty much utilize currency and economics to effectuate social programs, social progress, social engineering effectively. And look, it's no secret that economies, the freer they are, the better they generally perform. That's not to say there isn't a role for government. There are certain things that only the government has the capability to do, but that basically the more responsibilities that government takes on, the worse the economy performs, and the unintended consequences really cause great harm to individuals and to the country as a whole.
So what about, I know that people are going to say, what about monopolies? Well, shouldn't the government step in and bust up a monopoly or stop corporations from taking advantage of people? What would you say to that?
Well, historically, it hasn't worked out well. Just look, the last major monopoly the government supposedly took on was Microsoft. And during this time, Microsoft was doing some, I guess, things with, without much concern, like forcing computer manufacturers to take on their programs, forcible distribution, all sorts of things. But basically, Microsoft now is stronger than ever, certainly from an economic standpoint. So their efforts didn't work out well. Before that, there was the telephone company breakup. Mm-hmm. And that maybe arguably worked out better. But the reason it worked out better was that effectively more competition came into the market. But basically, over time, monopolies fail unless they're physical monopolies like your power company and your water, your gas company. Generally, monopolies like Microsoft really doesn't have a monopoly anymore. There are other operating systems. There's Google. There's all sorts of other things that have come about that Microsoft's monopoly isn't what it once used to be.
So left alone, the competitors will crop up and they'll eat the lunch of the complacent gorilla, as they get, more settled in their ways. There's opportunities that open up for the newcomer.
Exactly. That's not, and the government has been doing more and more to encourage concentration in industries and to aid and abet the very things that they supposedly were out to stop.
Gotcha. Okay, so we kind of understand the viewpoint that you see the world as, which is live and let live, kind of leave well enough alone, let the markets evolve. Let's talk about one of the biggest ways the government's interfering with our lives, and that is rates. And before we get into talking about Powell and where the rates are going, explain to me the economic structure that it would look like without the Federal Reserve, without rates. Like, how would we determine rates? I mean, would it just be private lending, or how would that come about?
Well, it's important to understand what the Federal Reserve does. They inflate the money supply. Right now, they're in the process of deflating the money supply. And you have inflation, and then you get deflation or, virtual economic collapse. They facilitate government's profligate spending by effectively printing up money for the deficit upon demand. And back in the golden era, I think it was after Andrew Jackson defeated the Second Bank of the United States, basically forced it into liquidation. We had free banking in the United States, and we were on a gold standard. Maybe that's not the best way to effectuate things, but it was a kind of golden era of growth until 1913. And somehow the government found a way to do all the things that it needed to do at the time. And those things were limited, of course. The traditional responsibilities of government are to protect the free market, to defend against enemies within and without, to provide a means of peaceably settling disputes among its citizens, the courts, and to protect against fraud. So all those things managed to get done during the time when we had no central bank, and interest rates got set naturally. Way back when there was no Federal Reserve, you still had bubbles because you're going to have speculative excesses, whether it's in stocks, railroads, various different markets. You get bubbles, but you couldn't have multiple bubbles blown at the same time, like real estate, like student loans, like auto loans, all those things, which eventually these bubbles pop. We saw it happen in 08 and 09 with the Great Recession, the real estate bust. Look, you're going to have bubbles no matter what because you got human nature, but you don't want the government to facilitate bubbles and, the everything bubble.
You hit on student loans there, and it's like, I think that is a crazy bubble, because if I'm loaning someone, let's say an 18-year-old kid comes to me and says, hey, I want to go to Clemson University and study political science for 6 years, and I want you to pay all my living expenses and my tuition, et cetera, et cetera. Will you loan me $200,000? That's not a great credit risk. I mean, I'm not going to most likely make that loan if I had to actually loan my own personal capital to this 18-year-old kid. And I feel like that's where a lot of this stuff creeps up. I mean, we saw this in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis, where when there's not somebody really footing the bill and taking on that risk is when, people do what they do. If you can take advantage of something, it's human nature to take advantage of it.
It's such a great example of many of these kids going to school, shouldn't be going to school, which is why a large portion of the student loans out there go to kids basically who never even get their degree, but they're still on the hook for the money. The government is got this role that I heard an economist once call it the accommodating loser. And in this case, no one in their right mind is going to loan a kid $250,000 to buy a Bentley or a Rolls Royce, but they'll loan them $250,000 to get a useless degree. At
least he can resell the Bentley for $200,000.
Maybe, yeah, and right, or arrange to get it stolen and get an insurance payout for the whole amount. But how do you repossess the guy's education? Can't be done. It's not adequate collateral. And
right.
If the market decides that this 18-year-old should get a Bentley or a Rolls, then they're undertaking the risk. It's a voluntary transaction. Might not be one you or I do, but that's the way the market works. And you know what? If the guy doesn't pay, then they'll repossess it and they'll suffer a loss, and they'll get a judgment against them for the balance. But point is, there's no accountability. When there's no risk, or the government shoulders all the risk, then the parties are there, the banks, whatever, they get the interest, they get the fees, and then the government shoulders the loss. So the loss has been socialized, but the profit is privatized. It's the worst of all possible situations.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. I think you said something really important, and I just want to appreciate that. The loss has been socialized, aka the American people, but the profit has been privatized, aka the universities. Is that what you meant by that statement?
Yeah. Universities and the banks,
And
they get their fees,
yeah.
They get interest, all sorts of things. So they love making loans that they have no risk to account for when the borrower defaults. It's the same thing. Any so-called government loan program, why is the government doing it in the first place?
Yeah.
Because the private sector won't. And generally, when it comes to protecting repayment, protecting their collateral and all that, the government's really bad at it. Private lenders are much more savvy. And so if they wouldn't make the loan in the first place, why should the government be doing it?
That's something that I quickly figured out in getting into real estate is if a couple banks really don't like your deal, you may not have that good of a deal on your hands. Because, these guys are doing this for a living and they know how to protect their assets. We all make mistakes, but it is a very telling indicator is if the creditors really don't like your deal, then you may not have that great of a deal. But let's move from the theoretical into the physical world, because we all know we'd love to live maybe in a pure market, but we don't. So we do have the Federal Reserve. They are raising rates. And do you think it's working? Let's talk about that. Do you think that the numbers and the data we're getting about inflation kind of leveling off, going down, is that true? Is it working? Are we going in the right direction? What are your thoughts there?
First, we need to look at how they measure inflation. And it's way different than from 1980. You've got all these distortions that have been introduced into it, hedonics, things like that, and then excluding food and fuel from the interest rates.
Why are they doing that?
Yeah, because it makes the rate look lower. So the rate is dramatically understated. Look, my favorite inflation indicator of all time, I think it's perhaps the best, certainly is the Thanksgiving dinner index. And that went up, I think, 26% last year. All right. That doesn't give the whole picture, obviously, because while there's certain sectors where the prices are going up, others going down, but commodities all up. So this little experiment here is doomed to failure. What it will do is throttle the growth rate, but we'll still have inflation anyways. And we'll get through it. I'm not buying necessarily that the U.S. will have a traditional recession. I think it's the 70s again of stagflation, where the economy has minimal growth, but technically not in a recession. But the prices of everything continue to go up. So their effort here will fail. And you as an investor, and look, just because I don't agree with the theoretical underpinnings of what the government does doesn't mean that I don't think you should take advantage of it and increase your net worth and your financial viability. That's the system we have. So what are you going to do? Are you going to go become a subsistence farmer where you don't have to participate in the market? It's not practical for urban residents to really be, off the grid, if you will, off the financial grid. It can't be done as modern society. So take advantage of it. And hey, look, real estate is one of the best ways you can do that, even in inflationary times.
So you're saying that the efforts are not going to work, that we're still going to, we're participating in inflation a lot worse than they're reporting. And I've noticed that with the food. There's no way food is only up 8 or 9%. I can just see that from my wife's grocery bill every week. And you're saying the Thanksgiving index year over year is up 20 something percent. So we may not fall off a cliff. And I kind of agree with you on that, but we're going to be sitting in this rising goods and services environment for how long, you think?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think anyone can predict that, but it could be a multi-decade thing like it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Inflationary cycles
Hmm.
are not these little blips on the screen. They are generational. And we
Wow.
could see inflation and depreciation of the dollar. What's inflation? Well, inflation is increase in the money supply under strict Austrian terms, and that leads to increased prices. It hits the economy differently. So what we had over the past 10 years, we had an inflationary period, but the inflation went into household assets. Recently, I had David Stockman on the show, somebody who I followed forever. And what he said is that the increase in household assets over the past 30, 40 years was 10 times what the increase in incomes was. And that's just something that just because you don't see the inflation from the increased money supply in your cost of living index until later in the cycle or at different times in the cycle doesn't mean it's not taking place. Household
Hmm.
assets. So when we look at housing prices and collectibles, I like the Rolex index. Rolex is over the past 5 years, 7 years have gone up 4 or 5 times on certain models, others
Mm-hmm.
even higher. That's an example of inflation taking place. Inflation isn't just the CPI numbers, it's asset prices as well. So, Will Rogers, famous comedian and philosopher, once said, invest in inflation, it's the only thing going up. He said that over 100 years ago. So, you need to be investing in inflation. And the best place where you could do that is in real estate with the proviso that the Federal Reserve will periodically pull the rug out from underneath you. And if you're improperly leveraged or set up in certain assets, it's going to be very difficult for you.
Okay, and I want to dig into that, guys. If you're listening, protection against inflation, real estate's one of the best ways to do that, with the caveat that you don't want to get into a position where the Federal Reserve can yank the rug out. And I think you're saying, Kerry, by getting into short-term debt or getting into where you have a variable rate where things can change and you're all of a sudden your cash flowing apartment or multifamily or self-storage or whatever, now it's not making sense. Your loan is coming due. The rates are higher than you had thought they were going to be, and you're jammed up. And I've been preaching that for the last 8 months now. Stop getting into any short-term debt, and any short-term debt you're in right now, refinance into long-term fixed debt.
Yeah, well, so we go back to Robert Kiyosaki, one of my favorites, because the first time I ever saw this concept expressed in the way he did, there's good debt and there's bad debt. Good debt makes you money. Bad debt costs you money. Example of bad debt is you buy that Ferrari, even though you could only afford a Camry, and you wind up paying all this debt that you didn't need to pay. Good debt is a mortgage on a property and the tenants pay the debt. But, there's risk in everything, and you might not have your numbers might be wrong. You might have issues that you didn't think about that leave you susceptible. And that's where like buying properties and types of properties in growing markets with growing populations really becomes essential. Although that's not to say you can't make money in New York State based on declining prices and, a lot of other factors go in. There's no hard and fast rule that says this is better than that and it's less risky. All you can do is look over the historic classes, because look, in the Great Depression in 08 and 09, people lost their shirts, but other people who were well situated were able to take advantage of that situation, buy up those properties for a song, and then hold on to them and wait for the inevitable inflationary wave to come in and boost prices. And inflation comes also, rising consumer prices, rising asset prices come from shortages, demographics, all these things are involved. It's not just money printing, but The primary source is money printing and government intervention.
But picking up these properties for a song, do you think that we are is this a similar situation to 2008-9? I mean, do you think that we're on the precipice of a real estate major price correction?
It could very well happen, although my gut feel is the government will keep printing money to avoid that situation. Look, there's a housing shortage in some fashion. I'm not sure how it really exists. There's a lot of empty homes that are being held by people. So on the surface, no, because you don't have these liar loans anymore. Banks are tightening standards, all these things. But on the other hand, it could happen very easily. It could happen because the cost of carrying debt has more than doubled over the past year. So maybe those deals that were super attractive at 3% aren't really attractive at 7 and 8%. So we have to see.
I was penciling a deal. I've been working on this deal since last summer, trying to negotiate with the sellers. And as the rates have continued to rise, I mean, I can't get anywhere near their ask price, and they've been lowering their ask price. And I actually even know what their basis is in this project, like with their loan and their investors. I can't even pay that and make the deal make sense with where the rates are today. And they're not quite stabilized. So I can't get a conventional loan on it. So I've got to go bridge debt. And I mean, bridge debt now is 9-10% interest. And so I'm not going to get myself into something that's going to hurt me. And I don't know what these guys are going to do because they're in bridge debt. Their loan is maturing this fall. And if that bank does not extend, well, they're going to lose all their investors' capital, and the bank's going to be stuck with it. Now, the bank's basis is probably low enough that they could liquidate it. But I do think some of that's going to happen. I don't know that it's going to be on a massive scale like we saw it in 2008-9. What do you think, though, over this next year is going to happen with the rates? Because Jerome Powell has said, I think in December, December, he said, I'm not going to lower the rates in all of 2023, if I'm remembering that right. Did he not say that? Do you believe him?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
He might not have a choice. Well, one thing going back, and this is why central banking is so pernicious, is that when rates are artificially low at 0% and you could get a 2.5% mortgage, a lot of deals made sense that but for those artificially low rates were not economically viable. All right. Yep. So
Agreed.
once the rates normalize at 5%, let's just say we go back to this world pre-08-09, pre-artificially low interest rates. And, the mortgage rate basically averaged 5% over the past 100 years with blips in either direction, right? I mean, there was double-digit mortgage rates in the early 80s. I lived through it. My first house, I think I had a 8 or 9% adjustable mortgage on it. But let's just say we go back to the world of 5%, then everybody has to revalue. There's a reset that takes place where the market wakes up one day and they realize, like what happened in 08-09, we got all these mortgage-backed securities. They're very AAA, but they're really junk, right? So a revaluation takes place, and those deals on the margins and even deals that looked very attractive all of a sudden become losers or break even. And then non-recourse mortgages, even people who were prime, see that they've got a losing asset here and they just walk away, right? Strategic default. They hand the properties back to the banks. And that's what's happening with malls and commercial real estate on a grand scale. The government can only put that off for so long before the piper has to get paid.
Well, and I can see that, especially commercial, but what about this? Let's say that I just bought my house in 2022, like in the height of everything, when this stuff was going nuts, and I'm fighting, and I paid $800,000 for my 3,000 square foot home, but I got a great rate. I got 2.7, 3.2, whatever. And now my house is worth $600,000. Well, it's worth less than I paid. However, I've got a 30-year fixed mortgage on it. Like, what is going to make me default on that loan?
You can't afford it. You lost your job, whatever. But basically, you hold on to it because you are getting on your borrowed money, you're getting to pay back in cheaper dollars, right? And you're actually getting a positive return on the money you borrowed, because if you borrowed it 2-3% and the interest rate and the inflation rate is 10%, charitably we put it at that, you're making 6.5, 7, 8% on that borrowed money by virtue of the fact that it's becoming worth 8% less per year. So you have to look at this in somewhat economic terms, and you got to live someplace, and you can't rent cheaper than your subsidized mortgage. So you're going to stick it out because there's that thing called, I can't remember the term of it, but the homeowner implied rent, how much if you rented your place out, you could get for it. All right. So let's say I'm paying $3,000 a month in interest and debt service, amortization on my loan, but that same place would rent for $4,500. So I could get $4,500, and then to get the equivalent home, I would have to pay $4,500. So effectively, you're making $1,500 a month off of that. All right. If you want to downsize, that's one thing. Then you could rent it out. So inflated rental prices will put a floor on how much your property can go down. Okay. So
True.
Until rents skid, you're basically safe where you are.
Yeah. And that's kind of my argument, that I don't think we're going to fall off the cliff with the single family, because if I'm in a 30-year mortgage on a low rate, unless I have to move, like my job is moving me or some sort of extenuating circumstances, if I can't rent someplace cheaper and I can't buy someplace with a lower payment because now the rates are higher, I'm just going to have to sit tight and wait it out. Kind of like people that bought in 2006 and 7, they had to wait it out a decade really before they were break even again. And so that's sort of my thought with where that's going. But getting back to the original question, you said Powell may have to lower rates in 2023. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, well, if it pushes the brake pedal too much, and brake pedal meaning raises rates too much, and we start seeing an economic collapse, and you might not see it here. You might see it overseas where all their loans are denominated in dollars. And, we have trillions of dollars of debt that foreign entities took on denominated in dollars. Now the cost of it goes up, not just in terms of what they're paying in interest rates, but because the dollar has gone up so much. The dollar's trading 104, 105 on the index right now. Mm-hmm. That could cause wide swaths of Europe and Asia to literally become insolvent. And it might very well be the European collapse that triggers Powell to start cutting back. Also, the other unintended consequence of rates going higher here is money is flowing in. That's also due to the Europe's energy crisis, their banking crisis, all these things, the euro itself being in danger.
I mean, their currency's in worse shape than ours, and the more we strengthen ours, the worse theirs gets. So you're saying that the world superpowers, the other powers that be, eventually could put enough pressure on Powell to say, listen, buddy, you got to cool it. You got to start lowering rates.
Yeah, China's in big, big trouble. And the money's flowing out of China, however they can do it, through cryptos, whatever it takes. They're getting their money out. Hey, I remember there's a project in the Bahamas called Bahamar, a huge casino hotel complex in Nassau, Bahamas. And the company originally did it was a local company. I guess they had a Chinese partner. They borrowed money from the Chinese International Development Bank. They defaulted. The Chinese basically own the project now, or through a nominee. But the intent of that project was never to make money for the Chinese Development Bank. It was to create this money-losing entity in the Bahamas and then they could funnel money out of China into that project, what's the government going to say? Hey, we're not going to allow you to do any more money. Okay, then the place gets boarded up. Then we have no hope of ever collecting money. So as a result, the money was made. The project was designed to lose money in a manner. This is my theory, by the way. I haven't read it elsewhere, but the whole purpose of the project wasn't for cash flow. It was to provide a vehicle to get funds out of China and in a very restrictive environment. My theory, I haven't seen it elsewhere, but I watched it and it never made any economic sense to build this thing. They already had a huge casino on Paradise Island, put that into bankruptcy. And as far as I know, this thing's not making any money. Maybe it will. Maybe inflation will bail it out because the value of their loan compared to what the actual value of the property is shrinking every year because of inflation. Prices go up. Maybe the inflation will bail them out eventually. But right now, it's just a money pit. And if you're a Chinese, wealthy Chinese person, and you have no means to get that kind of money out, billions, you find these money pits. And then what's the government going to do?
Right. Because if you're holding your capital in, your native currency and it's continually losing value against the US dollar, well, you want to be holding US dollars. And I mean, that's the beautiful thing about the long-term commercial debt too. It's like I fixed the debt. We took on a $10 million loan in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I think we got it in the low fours. And so as rents push forward, and things just get more expensive as they seem to always do, in 20 years, I mean, that mortgage, it doesn't go up. And what I'm getting $750, $800 a month for, I may be getting $1,600 a month for in 20 years or more, And so, but that debt did not grow unless, of course, I refinance it. And that's the power of good debt versus bad debt. And I think people, they think, oh, debt is bad. Debt is money, if leveraged and utilized properly. And I think that's also where you think about the United States, the debt that they have, right? The obligations that they have. And so it behooves them to print more capital, to devalue it, to make inflation go up, because it just makes everything easier to pay off.
They have no choice here. This is a effort to save the dollar, to stabilize the dollar because of all the stimulus and deficits and everything else. And the money is being sucked into the country, flow rates like you can't believe, like record rates. And effectively, you did what Will Rogers said. You invested in inflation. And inflation, my friend Jason Hartman, I'm sure you know him, he calls it inflation-induced debt destruction. And that aspect of real estate investing is more advantageous than ever before. That's not to say you wind up, people move out because they can't afford it, but you got to live someplace. The last thing you're going to stop paying is your rent, assuming you'll cut back on everything. You're not going to stop paying your rent and utilities, right?
Right. Well, Kerry, I could talk to you about this all day. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. So we've got Kerry Lutz, the Financial Survival Network. That's his podcast. What's the best way for people to connect with you, Kerry, and follow you on social or through your networks?
Well, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and all that. At Kerry Lutz at Twitter, Facebook. It's Kerry Lutz. Just find me. And of course, the main website, the mainstay, financialsurvivalnetwork.com. And I really appreciate you having me on, Jennings. Like I say, I could talk about this stuff all day. In fact, I have before. It's just nice to find somebody who wants to talk about it, because most people see this is the knowledge gap. And this is the other thing. One other thing I'd like to emphasize is that you really, really have to invest in human capital, meaning yourself. Get educated. Places like your podcast, Jennings, really great places to do it, because the one guaranteed return you will get in life, other than buying a useless degree at an Ivy League school like in puppetry, but you get the education now. And it's never been easier to become educated here, to actually become the true Renaissance man. That's what you need to do. Don't think that just because you graduated from college, law school, medical school, your education is over. Lifelong education, because then when you confront these situations we're in, you're going to have the knowledge to get through it, not just survive it, but thrive, to actually profit and really build generational wealth. The opportunity, I just want to make this really clear, even though I painted a negative picture, the opportunity now to build wealth has never been greater for the average person, largely because of the government screw ups, all this. Because the government will loan you money for a myriad of projects that you can make money on, buy assets that cash flow, that give you a return, that the debt will be diminished by inflation, and you will clean up in this time, and people look back and think you're a total freaking genius when you just followed the math.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. So guys, that's Kerry Lutz, KerryLutz on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Go out there and give him a follow. He's got a lot of knowledge to share. I know I've learned a lot on this show. So Kerry, appreciate you, man. And we'll chat soon.
Hope so. Pleasure being on with you.
Thank you.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.